Good morning. Today, we're here to answer one very important question. How do you identify plants? And instead of giving you a boring PowerPoint, we're going to try something a little different today. All examples in this presentation are Kansas wildflowers, and hopefully you will recognize some of them. So there are several crucial elements to identifying your plant. Plant type, color, petals, leaf arrangement, month, and habitat. To help practice, you can download the app Kansas Wildflowers on your Android or iPhone phone and practice identifying Kansas plants right now. So let's start with plant type. Now, forbs are your standard, quote, wildflowers. They are not woody. They are not grasses. They're just flowers, herbaceous flowers. Now, you might also encounter flowers blooming on woody shrubs, trees, vines, cacti, and grasses. So the first thing you should do is look for woody material. Trees, shrubs, and some vines can all be woody. The best way to tell those apart is to look at the height of the plant. Not all vines are going to be woody, but that can help you determine what kind of vine it is too. Some of those vines that are not woody might be considered herbaceous, so they're just kind of fleshy, like a standard forb. Woody vines include things like poison ivy, which definitely has flowers at some point of the year, and some of our grapes. If there's woody material on your plant, it's something a little bit different. Shrubs can be shorter than sunflowers and nearly as tall as young trees, but if they're old enough to have flowers, they almost certainly will have woody stems, even if they're short. Young vines, young trees, and young shrubs all look very similar because they haven't reached their full growth form, so make sure you look around you for matching leaves on other grown-up plants to help you decide what you're looking at. Once you've decided what kind of plant you have, the next thing you'll want to note, besides the color, obviously, is how many petals there are. Now, like we saw yesterday with the bean family, some flowers have really unique petals that are difficult to count. But here are some really common forms for the petals. Now, look closely because the individual flowers may be really tiny. Let's get started. Some flowers may have no petals. Now, this won't necessarily be true, but sometimes a flower can seem like it doesn't have obvious petals. Maybe it's the button bush, the scarlet Indian paintbrush, Leavenworth's oringo, or field pussy toes. Some of these flowers would also qualify as having many petals, but regardless, it's difficult if not impossible to count, and the petals may be so minor that it looks like they're not even there. And that's okay. Make a note of that, because the field guides certainly will too. There are only a handful of plants in Kansas that only have one petal, and those petals are really unusual. In both Jack in the Pulpit and Green Dragon, any petals are fused to make a tube or lily-like structure. These unusual growth patterns can give the appearance of only one noticeable petal. 2 is also an unusual number of petals for our wildflowers. A recognizable example would be the bee balms, or bergamot, and some dayflowers. Again, they may technically have more than 2, but any additional petals are modified or fused so that the flower ends up with the appearance of having just 2 petals. Plants with 3 petals start to be more regular. My favorite example of these guys is the spiderworts, which have grass-like leaves and distinctive violet-blue flowers with just 3 petals. Plants with 4 or 5 petals are vastly more common, with hundreds of possible species in our state alone. These flowers, like the prairie rose, milkweeds, and anemones, often have very distinct petals and look like your standard flower. Sometimes these petals are partly fused, like trumpet vines or bindweed, but if you look closely, you can usually find distinct lobes that give hints of the true number of petals there. Remember to look closely, because in some of our wildflowers, like purple prairie clover, the individual flowers are very small. Relatively few Kansas flowers have 6 petals compared to 4 or 5, but those that do are incredibly distinct and unique. This includes orchids like yellow lady's slipper. Yes, there are native orchids in the Great Plains, and also includes irises and lilies. Some other notable plants like the pawpaw tree and Nuttall's death camas also have the appearance of 6 petals. You may even have one of these blooming in your neighborhood right now, the white wildflower called Star of Bethlehem. Now, the last 3 categories of petal types are from pretty unique plants and have pretty unique petals. The first one is flowers that have many petals. Some wildflowers have so many petals that you shouldn't bother counting them at all. Sunflowers, daisies, thistles, cacti, and coneflowers, don't bother counting them because the number doesn't matter as much as another question. Are these flowers compound? A compound flower like thistles and sunflowers are actually a head of many, many tiny flowers crowded together onto one disc or globe. This is distinct from something like a cactus, mentzelia, or water lilies, where they do have many, many petals, but it's all in one distinct flower instead of being like an aggregate of many tiny flowers. So when you see a flower with many petals, pay attention to why these plants have so many petals, and you'll be able to sleuth out which plant you're looking at. Finally, second to last, we have peas. The last categories of petals here are really strange ones. So literally they are peas and irregular petals. We talked about peas in a nature journaling video yesterday, but these flowers always follow the same pattern and are very distinct. They have a banner, wings, and a keel. Don't mistake this weird flower type for an orchid or a lily. Look at many pea examples to memorize their distinct shape. You probably even have one example in your neighborhood blooming right now that you will definitely recognize, the redbud tree. Finally, Kansas Wildflowers uses this last category to catch many of the highly specialized, fused, and unusual looking flowers that we have, irregular petals. So this category includes orchids, bee balms, blue sage, penstemons, things like that. And we have already talked about these because these irregular petals may technically have a distinct number of petals, but again, just noting that the plant has petals with a very irregular shape, whether it's all fused like a tube or bunched together in an indistinct way, can help you identify it when you can't accurately count the petals or you're not feeling confident in the count that you've made because of that irregularity. So that's it for petals, which is the most complicated and distinct part of a wildflower. We won't get into this during today's lesson, but any further studying you do of wildflowers should definitely focus on traits that the whole family of wildflowers might possess. If you learn tricks to recognize a member of the mint family, or the sunflower family, or the carrot family, you might be able to skip counting petals altogether and go right to the other traits of the plant, such as those compound flowers I mentioned earlier that can help you identify them. So as we near the end of this introductory lesson, let's look at some incredibly important traits: leaf arrangements and habitat. It's easy to get distracted by the showy flowers, but never forget to look at, photograph, or take notes on the plant's leaves. This can seriously help you tell separate species apart that might otherwise be similar. So besides leaf shape, which obviously is really important to look at, leaf arrangement is incredibly important. Now, there are countless shapes and margins, that's the edge of the leaf, that exist out there. So I'm not going to go over those today, but I will give you a quick example on a few of those. Some leaves are entire margins, which means that there is no weird squiggles or shapes. It's just like a perfectly smooth outer edge. Some are serrated in different ways, which basically means they're like the edge of a bread knife, or they have these distinct teeth. Some leaves also have lobes, where it's kind of a round, smooth wave of different kinds. And there's so many variations on this that, again, I'm not going to go over it today. But besides those shapes, actually the leaf arrangement is incredibly important. There are 4 main arrangements to look for: alternate, opposite, whorled, and basal leaves. Most commonly, leaves are either alternate or opposite. In an alternate arrangement, the leaves will be staggered along the stem on each side of the plant, so there are no 2 leaves growing from the same point. In opposite leaf arrangements, the leaves grow paired on the stem, with each leaf having a sister on the opposite side of the stem. Whorled leaves, on the other hand, grow with multiple leaves in one place. So instead of twin leaves, there might be triplets or quintuplets all growing from the same place on the stem. This is pretty unique, and not many plants have this trait. Some examples you might recognize include the catalpa tree, where 3 leaves will grow from the same place on the stem, and plants like whorled milkweed, which is named for the whorls of long, skinny, rosemary-like leaves that grow along its stem. Finally, you'll want to make notes of plants that have leaves growing mostly at the base of the plant. This is called a basal arrangement. In these plants, instead of growing up along the stem in a specific pattern, the leaves may all be bunched up in a rosette at the base of the plant, with a mostly naked stem or very sparse leaves growing up along the stem. Think of dandelions. Make a note of these rosettes because this will be a distinct trait. Other examples in Kansas include some violets, buttercups, and primroses. Last but absolutely not least, do not forget to observe the habitat your flower is growing in. Is this a woodland flower? Prairie? Do you see it growing around you in multiple habitats, which is definitely possible? Is it in or near the water, growing in a damp ditch, or scattered across a high rocky hilltop? These notes are so important, so don't let your fascination with the plant itself install blinders to the rest of the environment. Look around you. Where the flower chose to live can mean the difference between similar species. And that's all for today's lesson. If you want to learn more about wildflowers, visit kswildflower.org or download their app, Kansas Wildflowers. Never stop looking, observing, and taking notes about what you see around you. And don't underestimate the power of documenting what you learn in a nature journal. I find this incredibly helpful with plants in particular because some of these botanical traits and terms are so different from what we're used to. It's really helpful to study them. So that's it. Get outside often and stay safe out there, guys.